Imagine boarding a plane and watching a quiet grandmother get kicked off the flight for something unbelievable. Passengers stared in shock as a flight attendant pointed to the door and said, "Ma'am, you need to leave. People are complaining that you smell strange." The elderly woman didn't argue. She simply stood up, holding her small handbag, and walked down the aisle while everyone whispered. To the passengers, she looked like just another traveler being removed. But seconds later, when airport security checked her ID, everything changed. The officer's face turned pale. The airport manager rushed over in panic, because the woman they had just embarrassed in front of everyone wasn't an ordinary passenger. She was one of the people who built the entire airline, and what she said next left the entire airport silent. Stay until the end of the story, because the lesson she taught that crew is something they will never forget. Everyone in the boarding area suddenly turned their heads. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step off this plane." The words were sharp, clear, and loud enough for several rows of passengers to hear. Conversations stopped instantly. A few people who were placing their bags in the overhead compartments froze mid-movement. Others leaned slightly into the aisle, curious to see what was happening. The flight attendant stood firmly in the middle of the aisle, one hand resting on the seat beside her, while the other pointed toward the open aircraft door. The person she was speaking to was an elderly black woman, sitting quietly near the window. She was dressed simply in a long dark coat, comfortable shoes, and a soft scarf wrapped gently around her neck. A small leather handbag rested on her lap. Her gray hair was neatly tied back, and thin glasses sat calmly on her face. She didn't look like someone causing trouble. In fact, she looked like someone's kind grandmother traveling to visit family. The woman blinked slowly, clearly surprised. "I'm sorry," she asked gently, her voice calm and polite. The flight attendant crossed her arms, her expression firm. "Passengers have complained about a strange smell," she said. "For the comfort of everyone on board, we cannot allow you to stay on this flight." The words hung heavily in the air. Immediately, whispers began spreading through the cabin. A man in the row behind quietly murmured to his wife. Two college students nearby exchanged confused glances. Someone further down the aisle pulled out their phone, pretending to check messages while secretly watching the situation unfold. Some passengers looked curious. Others looked uncomfortable. The elderly woman glanced around slowly, as if trying to understand what was happening. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she placed one gentle hand on the armrest and carefully stood up. Her movements were slow but steady, the way someone moves after many years of travel and experience. "I've been traveling my whole life," she said softly, her eyes meeting the attendant's. "No one has ever said that to me before." Her voice wasn't angry. It was calm, almost saddened. But the flight attendant didn't seem interested in discussing it further. She had already tapped something into her device and spoken quietly into a small radio clipped to her uniform. Within seconds, two airport security officers appeared near the aircraft door. Their presence made the cabin even quieter. The elderly woman picked up her handbag and straightened her coat with quiet dignity. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she slowly stepped into the aisle. Passengers moved their legs aside to give her space as she walked forward. A few people avoided eye contact. Others watched her with curiosity. To most people on that plane, she looked like just another passenger being removed. Maybe someone who had broken a rule. Maybe someone who had caused a complaint. As she walked toward the exit, the faint sound of whispers followed her down the aisle. "Did you smell something?" "I didn't notice anything." "Why would they remove her?" But the elderly woman remained calm. Her face showed no anger, only quiet patience. When she reached the aircraft door, she paused briefly and glanced back down the long aisle of seats. Passengers stared back, still unsure what had just happened. Then she stepped off the plane, escorted by security. The cabin door slowly closed behind her, and as the flight attendant returned to her duties, most passengers assumed the situation was over. To them, she was simply another traveler who had been asked to leave. Just an old woman who didn't belong on that flight. But what none of them realized was that the quiet grandmother they had just watched walk off the plane was far more important to that airline than anyone could possibly imagine. Outside the aircraft, the grandmother waited calmly near the gate. The busy airport terminal buzzed with the usual sounds of rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, and distant conversations. Travelers hurried past, focused on catching their flights, barely noticing the small scene unfolding near the aircraft door. Two security officers stood a few steps away, while the flight attendant explained the situation with confident certainty. "She's making passengers uncomfortable," the attendant said firmly, folding her arms. Several people mentioned a strange smell. "We can't risk complaints during the flight." One of the officers nodded slowly, though his expression suggested he wasn't completely convinced. Situations like this happen sometimes, but something about the elderly woman standing quietly in front of them didn't seem threatening at all. The grandmother didn't argue. She didn't protest or raise her voice. Instead, she simply listened, her posture calm and composed. She held her small handbag in both hands and waited patiently, almost as if she had been through difficult situations before and understood that reacting emotionally wouldn't help. The second officer stepped a little closer and spoke in a gentler tone. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "do you have your ticket and identification with you?" The elderly woman smiled softly. "Of course," she replied. Her voice was warm and polite, the kind of voice that immediately made people feel at ease. She opened her handbag and carefully pulled out her boarding pass along with her identification card. Her hands moved slowly but steadily as she handed the documents to the officer. "Here you go, dear," she said kindly. The officer took the documents and began checking them while his partner stood nearby. As he examined the ticket and ID, the grandmother lifted her eyes and looked around the airport terminal. Her gaze moved slowly across the bright lights, the large digital departure boards, and the endless lines of passengers moving through security checkpoints. But instead of looking nervous or embarrassed, she looked thoughtful, almost nostalgic. It was as if the airport held memories that no one else around her could see. In fact, it did. For decades, she had walked through terminals just like this one. She had witnessed the evolution of air travel, from the days when planes were smaller and tickets were handwritten, to the modern world of massive jets and digital boarding passes. She had watched airlines grow, new routes open, and generations of travelers take their first flights. She had seen airports transform from quiet buildings into enormous global travel hubs. Each terminal, each runway, each boarding gate reminded her of stories from the past. But today, none of that history seemed to matter. To the staff standing around her now, she was simply an elderly passenger who had caused a complaint. Just another traveler who supposedly didn't belong in first class. The flight attendant stood nearby, still convinced she had handled the situation correctly. She occasionally glanced toward the aircraft door, where passengers continued settling into their seats. Inside the plane, whispers were still spreading. Some passengers were curious about what had happened. Others assumed the issue had already been handled. A man near the window asked the person beside him, "Did they really remove that woman because of a smell?" His seatmate shrugged. "I guess so." Further back in the cabin, two passengers quietly debated whether the situation had been fair. But outside the aircraft, the real story was still unfolding. The security officer studying the grandmother's identification suddenly paused. His eyes moved back and forth across the card. For a moment, he frowned slightly, as if something about the name looked familiar. Then he looked up at the elderly woman again. The calm expression on her face hadn't changed. She simply waited patiently. The officer looked back down at the ID one more time, and suddenly his eyebrows lifted in surprise, because the name printed on that small identification card was about to change everything. The security officer suddenly paused while reading the identification card. At first, his eyes moved across the information quickly, the way officers usually check documents during routine situations. But then something caught his attention. His eyebrows slowly lifted. He blinked once, as if he thought he might have read it wrong. Then he looked again, and then once more. The terminal noise around them continued, rolling suitcases, distant announcements, travelers walking past. But the officer seemed completely focused on the card in his hand. "Ma'am," he said carefully, his tone suddenly more respectful than before. "Is this really you?" The grandmother looked at him calmly. There was no panic or confusion in her face, just quiet confidence. She nodded gently. "Yes, she replied with a soft smile. It is. The officer's entire posture changed in an instant. A moment ago, he had been standing casually, treating the situation like a normal passenger complaint. But now he straightened his back and adjusted his uniform slightly, as if he had suddenly realized the moment was far more serious than it appeared. He slowly turned his head toward the flight attendant. "Do you know who this woman is?" he asked. The flight attendant frowned, clearly confused by the question. "No," she replied quickly, "but she was disturbing passengers. We received complaints, and I had to handle the situation." The officer took a slow breath before speaking again. His voice was calm, but there was a clear seriousness in it now. "This is Margaret Lewis." For a moment, the name floated in the air without meaning. The two security officers looked at each other briefly. A few nearby passengers who had been watching the situation exchanged curious glances. To most of the people standing there, the name didn't mean anything. Margaret Lewis sounded like any other passenger. But just then, footsteps approached quickly from the end of the hallway. An airport manager had rushed over after hearing that a passenger had been removed from the flight. He had arrived expecting to resolve a routine complaint, but when he heard the name, he suddenly froze. "Margaret Lewis?" he repeated slowly. His eyes widened as he stepped closer, staring at the elderly woman standing calmly beside the officers. "The Margaret Lewis?" The grandmother gave him a warm, humble smile, the same gentle expression she had worn the entire time. "Yes, dear," she said kindly. The manager's face immediately turned pale. His mouth opened slightly as the realization hit him. You're the co-founder of this airline." The hallway fell completely silent. Even the nearby travelers who had been passing through the terminal slowed down, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The security officers exchanged stunned looks. One of them glanced back at the identification card again, now understanding why the name had seemed so familiar. The flight attendant, who had been standing confidently just moments earlier, suddenly looked as if the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. Her arms slowly dropped to her sides. Her confident expression vanished instantly, replaced by shock and disbelief. For over 30 years, Margaret Lewis had been one of the key people behind the airline's success. Long before the company became a well-known international brand, she had believed in the dream of building an airline that treated passengers with dignity and care. She had invested her own money when the company was still small and struggling. She had helped shape many of the airline's early customer service policies, the very policies that employees were still trained to follow today. Her ideas helped guide the company through its early years. Her support helped purchase its very first aircraft. And over time, that small airline had grown into a respected global brand. Thousands of employees now worked for the company she helped build. Millions of passengers traveled on its planes every year. Yet standing there in the terminal, dressed simply with her small handbag in hand, Margaret Lewis looked like nothing more than a quiet grandmother waiting for a flight. No special treatment, no attention, just another traveler. And now, the unbelievable truth hung in the air for everyone to realize. The woman who had helped create the airline had just been removed from one of its planes. Within minutes, the airport manager began apologizing repeatedly. His confident posture from earlier had completely disappeared. Now he stood in front of Margaret Lewis, with clear embarrassment on his face. "Mrs. Lewis, we are incredibly sorry for this misunderstanding," he said sincerely. "This should never have happened." The tension in the hallway was still heavy. Several airport staff members had quietly gathered nearby after hearing the news, and everyone seemed stunned by what had just been revealed. The flight attendant who had removed Margaret from the plane stood a few steps behind the manager. She looked completely shocked. Her eyes moved between the manager and the elderly woman standing calmly in front of them, as if she was still trying to process what she had just heard. You're the co-founder," she stammered nervously. Margaret nodded politely. Her smile remained gentle and humble. "I was," she replied softly. "Many years ago." The attendant's face quickly turned red with embarrassment. Her confident attitude from earlier had vanished. She looked down at the floor for a moment, clearly realizing how serious the situation had become. I didn't know," she said quietly. Margaret looked at her with kindness rather than anger. "That's true," Margaret replied calmly. "But that's not the real problem." Those words made everyone in the hallway fall silent. Even the security officers listened closely. The problem, Margaret continued gently, is how quickly people judge others. The airport manager slowly lowered his head, understanding exactly what she meant. Margaret spoke in a calm voice, not trying to embarrass anyone, but simply explaining the truth. The smell that bothered passengers likely came from a small herbal oil I use, she said. She lightly lifted her handbag and held it near her side. It's a homemade remedy for arthritis. I've used it for many years. A faint smile appeared on her face. It's not exactly perfume, she added with a soft laugh, but it helps my joints feel better when I travel. A few people nearby chuckled nervously, relieved by the light humor in her voice. But Margaret's message remained serious. She looked around at the group of employees, standing there. Airlines are built on trust, she said calmly. Passengers place their confidence in the people who serve them. Her words carried weight, not because of her title, but because of her quiet wisdom. Every person who boards a plane deserves respect, she continued, no matter who they are, how they dress, or what they smell like. The manager nodded slowly, clearly ashamed of how the situation had been handled. You're absolutely right, Mrs. Lewis, he said. He immediately tried to make things right. Please allow us to escort you to our private lounge while we arrange your next flight, he offered quickly. We will also assign a personal staff member to assist you, and we'll ensure you have the best seat available. The manager's voice was filled with urgency, eager to correct a mistake. But Margaret raised her hand gently. She wasn't interested in special treatment. Instead, she had one simple request. I appreciate your kindness, she said softly. Then she looked directly at the flight attendant and the other employees. But what I would really like, Margaret continued, is for the crew to remember today. The hallway grew quiet again. Margaret's voice remained calm but meaningful, because moments like this teach us something important. She paused before finishing her thought. The way we treat strangers, she said gently, shows who we truly are. No one spoke for a moment. The lesson was clear, and every person standing there knew they would remember that moment for a very long time. Later that evening, the story spread quickly throughout the airline. What had started as a small incident at one boarding gate soon became the main topic of conversation across the airport. Employees whispered about it in hallways, shared the story during break times, and messaged colleagues working in other terminals. A flight attendant removing a passenger from a plane wasn't unusual, but discovering that the passenger was one of the airline's own founders, that was something no one expected. Within hours, managers, pilots, and staff members had all heard the same surprising story. A quiet grandmother had been asked to leave a flight because of complaints about a smell. Moments later, security discovered that she was Margaret Lewis, the woman who had helped build the very airline they worked for. For many employees, the story felt almost unbelievable. Some felt embarrassed. Others felt grateful that Margaret had handled the situation with such patience and grace. Meanwhile, Margaret Lewis remained calm, just as she had been the entire day. Later that night, arrangements were made for her to board another flight. This time, things were very different. As she approached the aircraft door, the entire flight crew stood ready to greet her. The captain himself stepped forward with a warm smile. Mrs. Lewis, he said respectfully, it's an honor to have you on board tonight. Margaret simply smiled politely. Thank you, she replied. As she stepped into the cabin, the atmosphere felt welcoming and calm. The flight attendants greeted her kindly, helping her find her seat and offering assistance with her bag. A few passengers smiled politely as she walked down the aisle, unaware of the powerful lesson she had just taught the airport staff earlier that evening. To them, she looked like any other grandmother preparing for a quiet flight. But before taking her seat, Margaret paused. She turned toward the young flight attendant who had earlier asked her to leave the first plane. The attendant had been transferred to assist on this flight after the incident. She stood nervously near the galley, clearly unsure how Margaret might react. Her shoulders were tense, and she avoided eye contact at first. Margaret walked over to her slowly. The young woman looked up, her face filled with embarrassment and worry. Margaret gently placed a hand on her shoulder. It's all right, she said kindly. Her voice was warm and sincere. We all make mistakes. The flight attendant nodded quickly, her eyes filling with relief. Thank you, ma'am, she whispered softly. Margaret gave her a reassuring smile before turning back toward her seat. Soon, the cabin doors closed, and the plane began preparing for departure. As the aircraft slowly moved along the runway, Margaret leaned slightly toward the window. Outside, the runway lights stretched into the distance like glowing lines guiding the aircraft into the night sky. She watched them quietly, her mind drifting back to the early days of the airline. Back then, the company had only a handful of planes and a small group of dreamers who believed they could build something meaningful. There were long meetings, difficult decisions, and countless challenges along the way. But there was always one simple idea that guided everything they did. Treat every passenger with dignity. That belief shaped the company's values. It helped the airline earn the trust of millions of travelers. And it turned a small startup into a respected airline known around the world. Margaret smiled softly as the plane lifted into the air. Earlier that day had been difficult, but it had also served as a powerful reminder. A reminder that respect should never depend on appearance, status, or assumptions. Because sometimes, the person people underestimate the most is the very person who helped build everything around them. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful and inspiring stories just like this one. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next story. And remember, sometimes the people we judge the fastest are the ones with the most powerful stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Clapperboard.